Hi, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for our final webinar series with our guest speakers that have been discussing protection strategies. Before we get started, I just wanted to turn it over to our program coordinator, Eileen McCarthy, who's here to kind of go over the logistical arrangements for everyone to make sure everybody can engage and participate.
Hi, welcome to the webinar. So due to the large number of participants we have today, your microphones are muted to limit background noise. But if you do have questions or comments for Jessica or Louise throughout the webinar, please feel free to add those into the Q&A box, the question and answer, and we'll bring those to the speakers at the end.
Thanks. So let's get started. So just to introduce myself, I'm Jessica Lenz. I'm the Senior Program Manager for Protection here at Interaction, and I lead on the Results-Based Protection Program. And I'm also here with, as I said, Eileen McCarthy, who's our Program Coordinator for the Results-Based Protection Program. We've been basically reviewing protection strategies over the past 6 weeks. So I'd like to give a bit of a background about what we've been doing and our guest speaker series that has informed this session today. The objectives for our review have been to look at current approaches to protection strategies in terms of whether or not they support a results-based approach to protection. And in doing so, we are hoping to identify the critical components within a protection strategy that can support results-based protection. At the end of this review, we will have a summary and analysis paper. This will go out at the end of June, and this will be accumulation of all of the findings from the full methodology, which I'll explain in just a minute in terms of the interviews we've done, the desk review, and our guest speaker series. In addition, we will take that analysis and the findings, and we will be going in August, we will be going into an in-country and field visit to basically validate some of these findings and also address whether or not the findings are practical at a field base. So just to give a bit of the scope of our review so you can understand what we've covered as we've explored protection strategies, we've looked at 7 key components. The first is really looking at the process. So everything, the ins and outs of how it's put together. The second is looking at the content and the coverage. What is inside? Are we looking at outcomes or outputs? The third is looking at the analysis. So what underpins the protection strategy? So is it based off of a comprehensive protection analysis, or are the priorities being driven by something else? The fourth, we've been reviewing the causal logic behind the strategy, whether or not there is one, and if there is one, and what that exercise might have looked like to help actors come up with a causal logic. The fifth part of our review has looked at then the contribution by relevant actors, and therefore looking beyond just protection actors and looking at whether or not development actors or peacekeepers or others should be engaged to address a protection outcome. The sixth is looking at accountability in terms of who is accountable once this protection strategy is put together, the actors within it, and how do we hold those accountable, or should a protection strategy be something that we can use for accountability. And the seventh area has been then looking at the role of humanitarians to address threat. So this is the scope in terms of what we've been speaking to a number of different people about. Just to give you an idea about what we've done so far, that kind of sets the stage for this. The primary way we started was conducting several interviews with key actors in countries that have developed protection strategies, whether at an HCT level or at an organizational level, or even at the cluster, protection cluster level. So we carried out 15 interviews with 8 INGOs, as well as 2 country-specific NGO coordination bodies, and we've interviewed several PROCAP officers. Our coverage to date has been looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Lebanon, Nigeria, and South Sudan. And again, we've been looking at different levels of protection strategies. And so our initial desk review in terms of reviewing HCT protection strategies have included South Sudan, Nigeria, and Central African Republic. We've also had a series of guest speakers over the last 4 weeks and an online discussion forum where various participants from around the globe have been able to engage, raise questions, and help us think through protection strategies. So just to make sure that we all know what we're talking about, I want to give a couple of definitions here in terms of how we're defining results-based protection as well as protection strategies at this point. So results-based protection refers to results as the measurable components of an intervention that contribute to and include the outcome or impact, intended or unintended, positive or negative of the response. Outcome is measured in terms of reduced risk. So what is a protection strategy? At this point, what we're saying is it refers to a combination of efforts, often involving multiple actors and sectors, to bring about a desired protection outcome. A strategy is larger than a program. It should inform and be informed by a comprehensive set of efforts working towards a common desired outcome. And therefore, what is strategic planning for protection? This is the process of articulating the desired protection outcome or outcomes, articulating the pathway or causal logic to achieve it, setting out clearly defined corresponding objectives and indicators, and describing the complementary roles of the actors contributing to the desired outcome. Now, before we move on to our guest speaker today, I just wanted to go over a couple of the preliminary findings from the review. And this is because this is the closing of our webinar series. And those of you that have been following us since the very beginning, you will know that from this 4 weeks ago, we started with a webinar that discussed our findings, and there is a summary paper that is available online, and I have the website up there so that you can download that if you have not seen it. But that is a much more comprehensive webinar, and the summary paper describes all of the details in terms of those 7 areas that I just mentioned about what we were reviewing. But I just wanted to bring out 4 particular findings that we will build on today in our discussion, in addition to some others. But these were pretty important ones that came out of the review so far. So the first one was, what we found is that differing views and understanding of what a protection strategy is creates confusion and an inability to effectively engage in strategic planning processes. So right from the start, whether it's an HCT protection strategy or a cluster protection strategy, depending on how organizations or actors around the table understand what they are doing in the first place, defines what actually comes out of that strategy. The second finding was limited consultative processes undermine the credibility and uptake of a protection strategy, driven from the top rather than building from the ground up. So what we found probably over and over and over in most of our interviews and findings was that the consultation of engaging in a protection strategy was quite weak on several levels, and oftentimes it was very tokenistic. So actors may be engaged, but it wasn't genuine consultation. The third finding was it was very unclear about where the prioritization was coming from. So generally what we found is that many protection strategies were based off of activities that actors were already doing, where funding was already coming in, or where actors felt that they could do something in terms of the practicality of the situation, but not necessarily because of a comprehensive protection analysis. And so what we found is that there is a need for solid and purposeful data collection that is able to help us understand what that analysis actually is in order to inform the protection strategy. And then a fourth finding that came out of our discussions is that developing a context-specific theory of change may be useful in articulating the assumptions and the causal pathways to achieve protection outcomes. So it didn't happen quite often where an exercise like a theory of change took place, but actors felt that when this thinking and the discussions around change took place during the protection planning process or protection strategy process, it was more likely that the assumptions and the pathways would actually articulate what could actually be accomplished and be more strategic. So these are just some of the findings. Again, you can go and read the full findings so far on our summary paper, which you can get online. So now I'd like to turn to our guest speaker today, and we are really fortunate today to have Louise with us to close our 4-week guest speaker series on our online discussion forum on protection strategies. So welcome, Louise. We're glad to have you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yep. So just a bit of background, Louise Aubin is the Global Protection Cluster Coordinator. She's been the coordinator since 2011. Louise is Canadian and she is a lawyer by training. She's worked for UNHCR for more than 15 years and her career includes posts in Rwanda, Guinea, and Ethiopia. So we've asked Louise to come today to reflect on the overall findings and the discussions we've had to date. So as you can see, I've already pointed out a couple, but we'll go into those and several others hopefully during this discussion. We've identified several obstacles to effective protection strategies in terms of what limits them. And we've also identified several recommendations for how to approach protection strategies to better ensure protection outcomes. So in particular, we're inviting Louise to really share some thoughts with us today about how to move beyond those obstacles and towards overall better approaches to develop protection strategies. So just to get us started, with our first question and kind of to set the scene here, what we have found, particularly when we've been working on and really understanding what a results-based approach entails, is that it's extremely important that we have a robust protection analysis from the perspective of effective individuals as the starting point and the cornerstone of efforts to bring about protection outcomes. One of our guest speakers previously emphasized the critical importance of safeguarding a bottom-up approach when developing protection strategies, noting that this underpins the relevance of our response to people's needs and is essential for buy-in and ownership by the key stakeholders. In particular, this is seen as essential to avoid creating a protection strategy that is not simply a reflection of funding that is available or a list of activities individual agencies are prepared to carry out. However, we also know that bottom-up approaches take time and effort, and it's challenging to maintain that community-driven strategies when decisions also need to be made and resources need to be mobilized. So, Louise, a first question then to you. How do we ensure that a protection strategy maintains a bottom-up approach, but also benefits from decision and effective leadership?
Well, I think that's quite a fundamental question that you're posing, and I would probably emphasize even more. It's the need to safeguard a bottom-up approach. I would actually rephrase that and say that that's actually the cornerstone or the prerequisite for even embarking on developing a protection strategy. I don't think a single protection officer out there or a protection actor out there could claim to have found a solution to protection risks that hadn't first been identified by the very populations we're trying to protect. So protection strategy is actually the culmination of consultation with communities and persons that we're trying to protect. So I wanted to emphasize here maybe, because I think some of you, you're right to point out that some of your speakers and some of the participants emphasized this aspect of, or the starting point for strategy development. I wanted to emphasize an aspect that's quite difficult to ensure to do well, and that's the meaningful communication with these communities. It's a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue. Communities first need to be prepared before they're consulted. So they need to know what they're being consulted for. I say this because this is the result of many years of experience. I know UNHCR is not the only agency that uses participatory assessments as a means or an approach to consult communities, but where we've failed is where we don't prepare communities enough in terms of managing expectations. When they're being consulted, some communities should and might readily just assume that this will result in immediate delivery of assistance or services, but actually they need to understand that they're part of a strategy development. Secondly, where many of these consultations are weak is in feeding back to communities. So it's one thing to draw from communities what are the singular or prioritized risks and needs that they express. It's another to go back to communities and explain to them how you've prioritized the responses that they should be expecting to receive. And then thirdly, this feedback results in a collaborative monitoring and evaluation of whether or not the interventions that were planned were actually impactful. So I just want to make sure that we close that loop. The consultation with communities is not a one-off exercise. It's actually it's a continuous exercise, and it feeds into the whole cycle of strategy development, response, and then monitoring and evaluation. Now, you meant of course, a word on the other aspect of your question, which is about decisive decision making. And I think there the aspect of communication is just as important, but it's probably more lateral. In other words, the need to keep communication lines open and two-way with the partners and the different actors that you need to engage with in order to elaborate the strategy. So again, it's not a one-off exercise. As you build and as you build analysis around the data collected from communities, you're having to check in and out with different partners who have different experiences, different expertise, etc., and letting them know how you're moving closer to prioritization and the overarching framework, if you will, of your strategy. So I think among the partners, it's extremely helpful to do this. You can even explain to partners what methodology you're proposing and have them also, feed into the process itself. There are a few examples, and I just wanted, in terms of helpful tools, the handbook that was developed by the Global Protection Cluster, the Handbook on Protection of Internally Displaced Persons. There's a whole chapter on developing strategies, and it includes the step-by-step process that you might consider, as well as advice on how to run consultations with different partners. So you might want to look at that as well. And then I wanted to point to the Global Protection Cluster website, where we're starting to collect examples of protection strategies. And I'd really like to invite some of the listeners to contribute to that collection, so that we might maybe together analyze some of the better ones or some that have reached more success than others. Over to you.
Yeah, no, this is really helpful, and your point on two-way communication and continuous engagement with the population, affected population, is something that we've also identified within results-based protection, and we actually had another webinar series on this earlier in the year in January, when we really explored that and how best it can be done. So thanks for those thoughts. I want to build a little bit more on and looking at the protection analysis, because we know that having a really strong analysis yields a vast number of protection concerns. But some of the field practitioners that we've been speaking to express the concern that protection strategies include everything while then achieving nothing. So some kind of prioritization of the issues for interagency collaboration is necessary. Several of our guest speakers discussed the means for arriving at those priorities, and I just wanted to go over a couple of those in terms of how to prioritize and where prioritization should be informed by. And so they brought out engaging in a theory of change could be helpful, obviously using sound and purposeful data collection and analysis. They discussed ranking of what is reasonable and or practical to achieve given the context. And they also talked about consultations with multiple actors, including the affected population, in order to understand the priorities. They emphasized as well that that priorities need to be flexible, given how humanitarian situations evolve. So there is no doubt that we need to improve some of our methods and the process for determining priorities. But what should the basis be for this? So what do you think the criteria or the key considerations should be to prioritize? And how do you see prioritization being done in the future?
Well, I think several of the elements are found in the background that you just provided. Let me go through some of them. So during the first question, I emphasized the consultation with communities, and I think we need to be mindful about the quality of these consultations and how they're organized. We can be quite selective as actors in a hurry to plan, program, and deliver. And I say selective in the sense that, lessons from the past, and I hope it's from the past, is going through uniquely or exclusively through community representatives, these self-appointed people, leaders of communities, without also, not to undermine their position, but also to check in with other groups and categories of people in those communities that can be overlooked. I'll give an example with children. Communicating with children is quite is something particular. In other words, it's not like a dialogue with adults, and there are many experts in the field of child protection who would certainly argue that not everyone is equipped to be able to consult meaningfully and establish the necessary trust with children when you're doing participatory assessments. So a few tools have been developed to do this precisely, but unless you're going to invest in doing this properly, it might be more convenient to just simply skip over children and go to young adults, or skip over female leaders of some grassroots associations and go straight to the community leaders who are, more prominent in the community. So all this to say that the quality and the thinking through of how we consult with communities to be able to draw out the necessary data is quite fundamental. So going to the second point, and it's the whole issue of data collection, and there's no protection strategy that can be built without an evidence base. And so we're right to emphasize the community level and the individual level of this evidence gathering. And this needs to ensure to have several sources of information. Communities and the different categories and segments of communities, including minority groups within communities at risk, need to be sounded out. But there's also pre-existing data, and this is where I think there was a very interesting meeting convened by Interaction about a year and a half ago. And I was quite struck with this notion that a more anthropological approach to a situation, to be able to analyze what is currently going on, is quite important. So, for example, looking at a situation in Mali, for instance, at the outset of the emergency 2 years ago, not everyone was aware of the dynamics between the main ethnic groups fleeing and minority groups that were somewhat used by some of those majority groups as workers. Some would say even almost in slave-like conditions. These minority groups can be easily overlooked in terms of their protection risks and the needs, the very specific needs that they need to access in terms of humanitarian assistance. So looking at different sources of information from development actors, religious organizations, even the private sector we might need to look at. So data gathering in terms of establishing a sound evidence base does require looking quite broadly and not being too selective too quickly in order to do this. Understanding and knowing the different actors / partners that you need to engage with is quite important. I'm being mobile right now, just to explain why I'll be shortly out of breath. I need to find a power source for the computer, so we'll continue talking as I walk.
No problem.
These are the, oh dear. Okay, do you want to try to search for it? Oh, I don't know what to do now. Okay, shall we collect? Okay, let me go on and hopefully we won't be disconnected. I'm really sorry about this. We need to understand, I think we need to invest time in understanding the different actors and the potential partners that we could be working with. So the protection analysis really draws from the different expertise and experience of the different actors that we need to engage with. And I say here, let's take time and take stock about, what agencies, for example, have a specific mandate, and we could expect from them a type of analysis or an angle to analysis that might be quite helpful. And I'll come back to the different complementary roles of different actors when we're hopefully going to be talking about who does what once you've established your...
Louise, are you still there? I seem to have lost you. Just give us a second, everybody, as we try to reconnect Louise. As you heard, she was having problems with her computer power source. So hopefully she's able to reconnect with us in just a minute and we can continue our discussion. But while we're waiting, it would be great if everyone can start to submit some questions so we can have them lined up to ask them to Louise once she's able to return. And you can just submit those questions on the chat box. Louise, were you able to join us? Okay.
Any questions, please? How many people are online? 31. Go to that list.
Hello.
Hi, are you there?
Hello, this is Louise speaking.
Hi, Louise.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. We've asked participants to start submitting questions in the meantime, but I'm glad that you're able to reconnect with us.
Okay, I'll just catch my breath.
No problem.
I'm really, really sorry. So now I'm connected in through one of my very kind colleagues who's now vacating her workspace. The entire headquarters was alerted to this.
Oh, wow. No problem. So did you just wanted to pick up then, once you've caught your breath or whatever, from the last question that we were talking about and really looking at what's the criteria that we should be looking at and considering as we think about prioritizing within a protection strategy?
Right. I was saying, I think my last thought as I ran out the room, I think I don't think we invest, we think we know our partners, and I think we think we know the different actors, but I do think we need to invest a little bit more in understanding the roles and the operational posture of the different actors to be able to understand who can contribute to the analysis and from which perspective. And as I said a little bit earlier, that those who have knowledge of the situation prior to the crisis, I think have a lot to contribute, because the before and after picture is often missing from the analysis part of a strategy setting process. A last thought might be about causality, and I think this is where we see a little bit of a breakdown. For example, in strategic response plans, if we are now seeing more protection language in strategic response plans, we don't necessarily see an evident connection between the implementation plans of the different sectors, for example, and the extent to which they contribute to meeting protection objectives that is set out in the plan. So this causality, and I think you're right to emphasize what we now call a theory of change, what some donors have called a logical framework, what some agencies call a results chain or a results tree. This is all about understanding from your analysis, what is it that you could inject in terms of an intervention, a response, an activity that would actually trigger a form of change. And I think we'll be exploring what that means in a little while. So in terms of change, I also wanted to underscore a couple of things, that the analysis needs to take account of time and sequencing. So for example, not all change or not all results that we are seeking are going to be achieved in the same timeline. And I think that's sometimes very difficult to explain, and particularly to explain in the context of protection. If we're talking about behavior change, if we're talking about reducing risk, a lot of those things cannot be measured in the immediate. So we're going to have to construct a protection strategy that takes account of the needed time for you to start measuring the impact of your strategy. And in terms of sequencing, not all activities or interventions can take place or should take place at the same time. If your analysis suggests that foundational activities or interventions need to take place for others to then kick in. So sequencing might also be something that we need to look at.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that those are really important key factors, especially as we've been exploring theories of change as well, and in terms of really understanding the timing and the sequencing, and also your point on looking at the different actors. And that really leads me to our next question. And really what we've identified within a results-based approach is that it does take a multi-sectoral and a multidisciplinary response to really bring about protection outcomes. And therefore, in results-based approach to protection, we emphasize the importance of planning for the contribution of multiple actors based on the actions needed to address risks that people face. And so this could include actually roles of peacekeepers, development actors, special envoys, and even the broader diplomatic community or others that do not normally participate in humanitarian coordination structures. So how should we mobilize the contributions and actions of multiple actors to support the desired protection outcome and reflect these in our protection strategies?
I think this is one of the most interesting messages that have been conveyed through the recent statement on centrality of protection. This idea that protection outcomes necessarily require the input of protection actors and protection expertise, but protection outcomes cannot be fully achieved without the contribution of several actors, and these several actors beyond the humanitarian sphere. If you don't mind me quoting directly from the statement itself, I think it speaks volumes. I'll start. It starts with, it means that humanitarian coordinators, humanitarian country teams, and clusters need to develop and implement a comprehensive protection strategy to address risks and to prevent and stop recurrence of violence and violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. A strategy that clearly articulates and identifies the roles and responsibilities among humanitarian actors to contribute to protection outcomes, but that also identifies and makes use of all available tools and effectively protect those affected by humanitarian crises. Importantly, that takes into account the role and contribution of other relevant actors like peacekeeping, political missions, development actors to achieve the protection goals and solutions. So squarely there, and I end the quote there, squarely there, it is a strong recognition that once humanitarians identify those key areas where they need to intervene, I think the recognition comes swiftly afterwards that others need to kick in and align themselves with some of those priorities that we've identified. So this need to look beyond the humanitarian sphere, I think, is very important. I think it becomes very challenging for a protection strategy to properly articulate the entry points to these other actors. And this is where I think we still need, it's quite challenging, and I think this is where we need to look at closely in terms of what we have as examples in the field and creating those entry points. I think one of your speakers came from South Sudan, and I think there it was quite interesting and challenging at the same time. We're talking about a UN mission setting with many components. We're talking about pre-existing strategies to address human rights or to address some of the political realities in South Sudan, etc. How do you link up with this without being submerged by other strategies that are not humanitarian focused or necessarily protection focused? And I think there we still need to develop some guidance and some helpful tools. I think it is good to look at some of the existing examples, and I'll turn to Central African Republic, where one of the tools developed by the protection cluster there was a simple mapping of communities assessed at high risk of physical attack. Most of these communities, if not all of these communities, are minority groups in Central African Republic, and they were mapped geographically because they actually were enclaved in locations, either on their way to fleeing elsewhere or trapped in their villages of origin. This mapping of the protection cluster evolved over time and even had a bit of a traffic light control mechanism. In other words, through communication directly with those communities through mobile phones or through actors, local actors that are in the area, the protection cluster was measuring the level of risk faced by those communities. This mapping was taken up by the MINUSCA itself, and it has become a centerpiece of its planning in terms of presence of troops, but also in terms of prioritizing evacuations, humanitarian evacuations of these very populations. So you see the linkages there from a very simple tool developed by the protection cluster, but suddenly it was presented in a way that it invited the necessary collaboration of security actors, political actors, human rights actors to be able to do something with this. where humanitarian actors saw that they had severe limits in terms of operationalizing what they saw as a very critical need. So I think it's through these examples that we can start seeing not only the benefit, the necessary benefit of including actors beyond the humanitarian sphere, but it's also developing means and ways, not just vocabulary, but means, tools, and ways of engaging them to do something sometimes that is complementary, sometimes collective, but necessarily for the better protection of people.
Thanks, Louise. Yeah, I think these are really good points, especially looking at existing protection strategies or just strategies in general in terms of addressing particular risks and where we can identify those linkages. Maybe to build on that a little bit, as well as, and I know you were quoting some of the language out of the centrality of protection, but that statement emphasizes the role of humanitarian coordinators, humanitarian country teams, and clusters to adopt a comprehensive measures to ensure protection of all persons at risk. However, the whole of system protection review that has just recently been sent out found that humanitarian actors do not see themselves as having a role to address the violence and abuse that drive the risk patterns experienced by affected populations. Given this, what is the role of the humanitarian community to address threat, whether directly or indirectly? And how should protection strategies reflect the role of humanitarian actors and their collaboration with other actors to address the threat?
Well, like the statement itself points out, in any armed conflict or in any humanitarian situation, actually, the parties and the state has a primary responsibility to assess and protect people, and I think that's unquestionable. The problem is that a main feature of modern conflict in these complex emergencies that we're having, that humanitarians have to respond to, there's a total disregard for the norms and standards of international humanitarian and human rights law. ICRC regularly points to the fact that civilians are not only increasingly caught up in violence, but control over the civilian population is often one of the things at stake in the conflict itself. So we can hang our hat on state responsibility, but reality is much different. And the overwhelming scale and level of brutality and violence committed against civilians in armed conflicts today are attributed to a multiplicity of reasons: the proliferation of weapons, control for natural resources, even state collapse. Recently, more analysis points to the rise in terrorism and intercommunal conflict, religious struggles, etc. So it's a very complex environment in which humanitarian actors find themselves, and it's becoming more dangerous. I mean, with the proliferation and fragmentation of armed groups with unclear chains of command, the pressure and the obstacles posed by states in regards to humanitarians to be able to work themselves, you can imagine that this is all rather complex. So this is to say that I think humanitarians can be more upfront and more explicit and articulate in showing the limits of humanitarian action, particularly in armed violence or conflict situations. But it does not mean that violations of human rights, violations of international humanitarian law should go unreported or undetected. And I think this is where we need to strike a much healthier operational balance, making sure that if we are on the ground, we can also contribute to diminishing risks. If we cannot diminish violence, we can mitigate risks through some interventions. And I think that the very same whole of system review study did point to the fact that humanitarians are limited in terms of their contribution to alleviating risks in many modern situations today. So I think I think we need to reconcile both those realities.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think, just some of the issues that some types of violence and human rights abuses that we see arising out of different crisis environments actually poses an interesting question that we've had come up a couple of times in our interviews on whether or not protection strategies should be made public or be kept confidential, especially when such actors like the government is clearly responsible for human rights abuses. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. How do we develop a protection strategy that's not watered down and genuinely describes the pathways needed to reduce risk and enhance protection?
Right. I found I find this question a little bit difficult to answer without looking at a specific context. Probably because first I would expect that any overarching protection objective or goal of a strategy should be defendable. In other words, I should be able to speak confidently with government interlocutors, with donors, with different partners, even non-state armed actors, about what it is that humanitarians are trying to achieve in order to protect civilians or people affected by a crisis. I think that should be defendable, and therefore it can be and should be articulated. Now, I think there's a difference between that and your, what I might call like sub-strategies. In other words, your approach to advocacy and how you want to incrementally effect change. Because some of those things do require a softer approach in terms of engaging different actors. So divulging your end game prior to actually starting to engage with more difficult actors might actually foil your plan. So I think from that perspective, if a protection strategy should articulate for itself and for others what needs to be achieved, how you achieve this, I think there are some aspects to this that are more tactical and therefore don't necessarily merit to be entirely exposed publicly. Of course, different contexts might dictate different formula to be able to tackle this, where, for example, the state is not a party to the conflict. You might need to be much more open and engaging with state actors to be able to align themselves and engage other actors. Where the state is a party to the conflict, this obviously is quite different. The confidentiality issue is crucial, but needs to be, I think, a bit contextual and look at different country situations. Advocacy is an aspect of these protection strategies that, like I say, need to be mindful of tactics, but also I think advocacy needs to adjust quite frequently because you're actually testing the positions, perceptions, and actions of different actors you're speaking with. So from that perspective, if everything was public from the get-go, it'd be very difficult to try to adjust at a later stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Just given time as well, and I want to make sure that our guests online as well have an opportunity to ask some questions. I want to kind of close our kind of dialogue here with a final question to ask you a little bit in terms of what success looks like. So we need protection strategies to help us achieve concrete and measurable outcomes in terms of reduced risk and enhanced protection. So how do you know if a protection strategy has been successful, and what measures should we be using to gauge this success?
And yes, because we're wrapping up, I'll mention a couple of things. I think one aspect we probably haven't emphasized throughout this discussion might be the need to embed a solutions approach from the very outset of, or the very first protection strategy. The solutions approach might be the language that we use in displacement settings, or we might use the notion of a development approach in the very humanitarian protection strategy that we're developing. And the reason I say that is because that goes a long way to measuring the impact and the necessary recognition that change happens over time. There's a lot of discussion today, or a lot of emphasis today, on value for money or life-saving interventions. And all of these notions connote immediacy. There's urgency in action, there's no question. But in terms of measuring impact and measuring results, this is measured over time. And we need to invest some part of our protection strategy for a longer term result. And so I think that's something I did want to underscore in the discussion we've had. Perhaps another aspect of this is the tool that needs to be part of a protection strategy, a monitoring tool of the protection strategy. So with every protection strategy and for every result that we're seeking, we should be able to elaborate a few key indicators through which we measure progress as we implement the strategy. Indicators are not very easy for protection work, and I think Interaction has certainly led several discussions around, in your whole project of results-based protection, on indicators or benchmarks that can properly measure the impact of protection interventions. So that's why there's quite a bit of use of proxy indicators and different methodologies to try to triangulate and measure the impact of protection work. The monitoring tool is also a management tool. So as for example, the statement of centrality of protection emphasized the role of the very necessary leadership role of a humanitarian coordinator and the heads of agencies in a humanitarian country team, they need to monitor, they need to evaluate the value of the protection strategy. And in terms of prioritization, if something doesn't work, it should be deprioritized. So this whole management approach to what works and need to be measured is also a way of being rational about resources used. I can't help but adding a last point. And there's a lot of fantastic work being done by international and local actors in complex emergencies that we're dealing with today. But there's a point of humility, I think. And one thing that doesn't appear very well in any protection strategy drawn by humanitarian actors, it's the recognition that there are many things that humanitarian actors do to protect, but there are many more things that only communities do to protect themselves. And how that clear understanding of the relationship and complementarity between humanitarian interventions and community-based protection, how this is reflected in protection strategies and how this is monitored and how the causality between interventions or community-based initiatives actually contribute to protection. I think this is a whole area that we need to scrutinize much more if we're going to really be an added value to the lives of people affected by crisis. I think we need to also be very mindful, humble, in fact, about the contribution that we make without first putting forward what communities have been doing and continue to do for themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Louise, and especially your last point. I think this is a key element of results-based protection that we have focused on over the last couple of years, and really identifying what communities are already doing for themselves to protect themselves, and how do we identify those but build from them so we don't undermine them. So I think that's a really good kind of point, a last point. I really want to thank you for this discussion, but I'd like to now open it up to our participants online to see if there are any additional questions that they'd like to ask you. Do we have any?
have questions, feel free to send those through on the question box, and then we can bring those up to Louise and Jessica.
Why is it blinking?
Hi, Louise. It's Jenny here. So while we're waiting to see whether anyone wants to throw any additional questions your way, I thought I would just kick off a little bit. So we're starting to have some really interesting discussions within the GPC community about HCT protection strategies, very much in line with the centrality of protection statement and as highlighted in a few operational peer reviews thus far, that HCTs should be coming up with protection strategies. One of the things we need to grapple with, though, is what's the difference between a protection cluster strategy and an HCT strategy? And there are a couple of different ideas thrown about. One that we discussed the other day was a protection cluster should identify the issues and the actions which are beyond its own capacity to mobilize a response and throw them up to the HCT in order to mobilize, you could say more of a whole of system response. And there are certain, it could be because, the risk being faced is so systematic and pervasive because, it demands a multi-sectoral response rather than sort of more siloed or more standalone type of programming. But I wonder if you have any additional thoughts on, how we should be thinking about what is the difference between a protection cluster strategy and an HCT strategy and how they might relate to one another.
It's a very timely question, Jenny. So good to have you pose it. From my perspective, I think a protection strategy is overarching. It doesn't matter if you're talking about an HCT, a protection cluster, a working group, a shelter cluster community. I think a protection strategy is that vision with very clear and specific objectives that guides a humanitarian response holistically and creates those entry points for, as we mentioned, the entry points for other actors and existing strategies to tap into it or to align or be cognizant of. So this protection strategy is overarching. Then comes an implementation plan, and I think this is where the contributions of the different sectors or clusters, the different actors with specific mandates or the special envoy, or the implementation plan is a description of who does what, where, and how as a contribution to the protection strategy. So if the protection strategy is, if we've spoken about, if the protection strategy is informed by what communities have identified as critical risks to them, if the protection strategy has a sound evidence base and has been collected, has been, been built on the basis of sound data, and if the protection strategy has ensured, the collective view of what needs to be prioritized, then I think it should be that framework that guides the implementation plans of different actors and sectors. Ideally, I think what we're talking about is a proliferation of words called strategy that have been thrown about, but I think conceptually, I think we can see that there's a need for having a single strategy that federates the efforts, the expertise, and the resources of different actors and aligns them for very clear outcomes that were agreed need to be prioritized. I don't know if that's clear enough. Over to you.
Oh, do we have any other questions?
Great. Yeah, we have one question. Just a second. So reference was made to timeframes and the concept of life-saving and prioritization. What do we need to do as though protection gets deprioritized on a regular basis in emergencies as it's not considered life-saving? So what is the GPC doing about this?
Well, we've firstly identified what the problem was. There were a series of studies and reviews that we commissioned. It started with the child protection community within the Global Protection Cluster, who first commissioned a study on child protection funding. Now that led to more in-depth conversations around protection generally. So we commissioned a second study, and interestingly, the second study we thought would result in a similar conclusion that, you know, protection is underfunded and is undervalued and needs to be, you know, prioritized. It went a little bit deeper in the sense that it made us realize that how we explain protection, not just as a set of activities delivered by a few technical agencies, but how we explain protection as a purpose behind the humanitarian response, how we explain protection as a lens through which we ensure that our programs are safe, sound, and impactful. So protection mainstreaming aspect, those different dimensions of protection needed to be better understood. So I think there are many ways of understanding or trying to understand why protection risks being deprioritized. It's very difficult to accept that in any humanitarian response, protection as an issue or protection as an ultimate goal or purpose could ever be deprioritized. I think we need to differentiate, again, if I need to summarize, I think we need to ensure that protection guides a humanitarian response. So therefore, it's a purpose. It's the outcome against which we measure the rest of the response. But as activities, we need to look at all sectors. We need to look at all sectors of intervention to the extent to which they meet protection outcomes. From that perspective, I don't think any humanitarian response today, in view of the shrinking resources and the difficulty in operationalizing what we need to do, can afford to deprioritize any sector. The issue is not about entire sectors being prioritized or deprioritized. The issue is much more evaluating the contribution of each sector for protection outcomes. So the extent to which the education community can adjust its strategy and interventions to meet the specific protection outcomes that have been prioritized by the humanitarian country team, that's what we need to look at. Not whether or not education is a priority, but rather the extent to which education actors contribute to an outcome.
Great. We have another question. So building on the point made about the relationship between the protection cluster and HCT strategies, how would the latter relate to a strategy developed at the country level in the context of Human Rights Upfront Action Plan?
I think there are different entry points for this. I think as we were discussing, we need to, we map issues, but we also map actors. We map actors for implementation of specific services, but we also map actors in terms of their contribution, the influence that they might exert to change the behavior of perpetrators of violations, or the influence that they might have in terms of shaping a political solution to a particular crisis. Human Rights Upfront is meant to be a change of, perhaps re-emphasizing the priorities of the UN community. When human rights are at play, that is your principal consideration in terms of understanding and triggering action, whether it's political action, human rights, development, etc. So I think if the strategy is built at the country level, are explicit and and how do you say, detailed enough in terms of what they need to achieve, and if there are challenges and blockages to achieving those, I think a humanitarian country team should have at its disposal the ability to analyze what actors and what action needs to take place to unblock these situations. And some of these situations need to be unblocked by a much more high-level, headquarter type of intervention. For example, in mobilizing member states to exert pressure on a given government in terms of its actions or the challenges that it poses to protection work in the field. I don't feel I'm being very precise in answering this question, and it's possibly because I, like others, haven't fully understood how all these, how the initiative, the Human Rights Initiative, plays out at the country level. What we're seeing evolving are the triggers for robust discussion at headquarter level, meaning in New York, but how these discussions among key leaders of the UN system can mobilize action. This is where we're still needing to see the connections. There's a lot of work, I'm sure, that goes unnoticed by humanitarian actors in terms of political mobilization, etc. But it's I think it's still early days for us to be so explicit in explaining how the different elements of human rights up front, in terms of the consultations that are done at headquarters, how they link up to impact at the field level.
Great. So we have another question. Some of the previous speakers and findings show that there is a need for dedicated coordination to support a protection strategy, particularly to ensure genuine consultation and ownership. How do we ensure a protection strategy is facilitated in a manner that is consultative and not driven by agencies' mandates?
It's an interesting way of posing the question. Coordination is not an end in itself. It's a means to achieving something. So I think in any endeavor, whether we're talking about developing a protection strategy, or if we're talking about monitoring the impact of the different activities and interventions of the cluster, coordination is essential. It's a cross-cutting approach to pretty much everything that we do. When you're saying, when the participant highlights the need for dedicated coordination, I think it speaks to the necessary neutrality of the leadership role of an agency, or rather, the way all partners equally contribute as they are expected to contribute to a collective piece of work, whether it's the protection strategy itself, whether it's the monitoring of, whether it's planning for future activities. So dedicated coordination, I think, speaks much more to the good broker role of a lead agency, but it also speaks to the expectations that we all have, that all partners need to come to the table to contribute, and this needs to be on an equal footing and really be reflective of the broad partnership that we need to bring on board in a protection cluster. And dedicated coordination cannot sit alone. Dedicated coordination does require as well a decision-making process that is transparent but decisive. I mean, that's the nature of decision-making. At the end of the day, some decisions need to be taken. The best form of decision-making is through consensus. Otherwise, it is about setting parameters that are very clearly understood and agreed for decisions to emerge. So I totally subscribe to the notion that coordination is an essential element to building strategies and to decision making. We just need to be very clear as to the need to achieve something through this coordination. Over to you.
Thank you, Louise. And I think we're just out of time, and I don't think there's any other questions at this point anyways. But those online, that if you do have additional questions, you can still submit them on our online discussion forum, and we can still take those forward as we think through protection strategies. But I just wanted to really thank Louise today for engaging with us and talking to us and reflecting on some of the findings and giving us your own thoughts and recommendations on how to improve protection strategies. So yeah, thanks so much for that.
Well, thanks, and thanks for agreeing to the little hiccup we had earlier. So
yeah, no
very
problem.
much for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, we went just a little bit over time just to allow for that discussion and engagement with you. I just wanted to let others know how you can continue to be involved with us on this. Again, as we said, this is an ongoing review that we've been doing and really to shape how we understand results-based protection. And currently, we will be taking these findings to the field as well in August. So I'm just going to turn it over to Eileen again to tell you how to continue to be involved with us and engage on this discussion.
Yeah, so we still have our online discussion forum going for another day. So if you'd like to join, please feel free to register and I'll add you to the group. You can catch up on what we've discussed so far and pose any additional questions or examples that you might have. Also, to sign up to get future updates of the activities of the Results-Based Protection Program and some of the resources and materials that we're able to circulate, do sign up on our homepage and you can get those updates straight to your inbox. Also, as we mentioned, this is the last of a series of webinars that we've been holding. So you can catch up on the recordings of those previous webinars on our website.
And really want to thank everybody for participating today. And again, a really big thank you again, Louise, for taking time out of your, I'm sure, super busy schedule to talk with us. And everyone should be looking forward, hopefully, to the summary and analysis of this by the end of June. So we'll be circulating that to everyone. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.